For the whole month of September, we're celebrating Suptember on the Cinemasters channel, so be sure to check out the weekly podcast for superhero-related conversations and reworkings of movies and shows. But for This Is a Thing, I thought I would explore what superheroes represent. This is a tricky topic, so I'm going to focus on two for now. In this episode, I'll be looking at the Punisher, and stay tuned for the next episode in 2 weeks where I'll look at Captain America. It's Suptember, all month long right here on Cinemasters' Ultimate Timeline. And now, to the show. So the Punisher is a thing. I guess it's not currently a thing because the show was unceremoniously cancelled because Disney wants to own everything, and so they took back the deal they had with Netflix. But the Punisher character is still very much a thing in the comics. He's probably doing some stuff, unless he's currently dead. Comic book superheroes tend to do that from time to time. Either way, the Punisher is a thing as both a character and a show, and I was a big fan of the Netflix interpretation. Bring back John Barenthal as the Punisher! Yeah, those sentiments have not changed. Although this rendition might be considered too gritty along with the rest of the Netflix Marvel shows, I think it benefits from this, unlike some of the less serious versions of the past. Although I guess this is a past version now too. As far as superheroes go, the Punisher is a strange one for me. I wasn't always a fan of the character. I liked antiheroes like Wolverine, although Logan's stories always seem to be about how he is a better person when he is with a team of people who care about him, which starts to reduce the anti-part of the antihero for him. The Punisher, on the other hand, always pushes people away and always wants to work alone. With no superpowers, he just uses a lot of guns and makes decisions about who or what needs to be punished arbitrarily. Not gonna lie, but on paper that sounds pretty edgelord to me. But when Netflix introduced their superhero miniseries, I watched because I'm a big fan of Iron Fist. Don't judge me. That show was disappointing enough anyway. But the other shows were all great, and a few of the seasons were even some of the best television I've ever seen. Did you watch Daredevil? No, seriously, did you watch Daredevil? Because in that show, the Punisher was introduced, and I was intrigued by this iteration of the character. So much so that when it was announced that the Punisher would get his own series, I knew I would watch it. But that's a bit of a misnomer because I only actually watched the first episode. Because I binged the rest of them. And of course, when season 2 came out, I was just as enthused. Although it was not as tight as the first season, I still really enjoyed it, and you can hear more about my thoughts on season 2 on an episode of the Cinemasters podcast if you're interested. This version of the Punisher resonated with me in a way that past versions had not. I thought this might have been because of the show's presentation or changes made to the Punisher, and there are some changes, but they all work to get to the core of who the Punisher is as a character and what he represents. Because I was 100% wrong about the Punisher, and so are you. Probably. I don't know your life. And the reason I say that is because a lot of people get this wrong. The Punisher logo has been used and misappropriated by certain groups because they, like me, missed the meaning of the character and the stories that he's used to tell. The music in the show, the emphasis on the sympathetic antihero, the use and depiction of brutal violence, and most importantly the difference between Frank Castle the Man and Frank Castle the Punisher are all purposefully crafted in service of representing the character and his story as they were intended to be understood. Since as far back as he became an antihero, the way that his stories were supposed to be understood was as westerns, or more accurately, revisionist westerns. And so today, I want to talk about the Punisher. The Punisher was originally introduced as a Spider-Man villain who was working for the Jackal, but ultimately had his own reasons for fighting Spider-Man. With a more interesting motivation than most villains, the character was explored more, which eventually led to his own comic series telling the story of an anti-hero. The Punisher on Netflix began out of Marvel's stint of superhero shows, which began with Daredevil in 2015, and slowly introduced more characters in subsequent series. All of them took place in the same universe, and often shared minor or major characters. Much like Luke Cage, who was given his own show after appearing in the first season of Jessica Jones, Frank Castle, or the Punisher, was introduced in season 2 of Daredevil before getting his own series. The show was created by a different team than Daredevil, led by Steve Lightfoot. They had John Barenthal reprise his iconic portrayal of Frank Castle, and added Ben Barnes, Amber Rose Riva, and Jason R. Moore as series regulars, and they even had Deborah Ann Wool as Karen Page on for a few episodes. Here comes the summary for the show, which includes spoilers for both seasons of The Punisher, as well as minor spoilers for the second season of Daredevil. So be warned. After surviving his time in prison and going through all the court proceedings, Frank is now living under the name Pete Castiglione, and the world at large believes that the wanted criminal Frank Castle, also known as the Punisher, is dead. But then Frank is contacted by another man in hiding calling himself Micro, with information about a crime that was committed by a special forces group Frank was a part of during his military time. Meanwhile, Special Agent Dina Madani with the FBI is investigating the murder of her partner, who was uncovering the truth about a heroin smuggling operation that was conducted by Frank's superiors. These are the people that Madani herself works for now, and the same people who killed Frank's family and want him dead to keep him silent. But Frank and Micro team up with Madani to take down these corrupt individuals in the government, which includes Frank's old army friend Billy Rousseau. But because of this work, Frank is once again given a clean slate. In the beginning of Season 2, in an attempt to get away from his old life, Frank has left New York and is once again using the name Pete Castiglione. But when he runs into a young girl named Amy running from a shady organization of which she has intel on, as well as Billy Rousseau waking up from the hospital, Frank is once again dragged back to New York. While he deals with Billy's continued betrayal, the corruption of Testament Industries, and keeping Amy safe from the mysterious John Pilgrim, Frank comes face to face with the question of what it means to be the Punisher. And then it was cancelled. Apparently there were plans for the Season 3 villain to be Kingpin, with Daredevil himself set to show up, but that's not happening. I mean, there are always rumors of a reboot. And Charlie Cox is all but confirmed to be playing Matt Murdock in the new Spider-Man movie, so maybe uncancelled? Okay, so perhaps you're like, what the fuck is Janglez smoking? He thinks this show or story is a Western and that the Punisher character is a Western hero? But he's so obviously an anti-hero. Well, hear me out, because just as I explained that Jessica Jones was a noir, I can make sense of why the Punisher is a Western. Westerns, like all genres, do have certain tropes that are indicative of the style. Guns and cowboy hats come to mind, but there is a structural component that I want to draw attention to. This is what's called the monomyth. Now, you're probably familiar with Joseph Campbell's The Hero's Journey, or The Hero with a Thousand Faces. This is the classic monomyth that most if not all stories follow, and it works incredibly well for story building. This is the basic idea that every hero has a thing they need, so they descend into hell or the underworld or some metaphorical version of that, and they return having given something up for the object or knowledge that makes them stronger. You've seen this before 100 times.
Here we go. Of course, this thing is just a circle. You'd think it was so goddamn complicated.
However, when the Western was at its peak, scholars and critics began to notice a change, or at least a slight alteration in the way that the monomyth was being portrayed on screen. Two of these scholars were Robert Jewett and John Shelton Lawence. They posited the idea of the American monomyth as a distinct subset of the version of this hero with a thousand faces. A paraphrased version of their idea goes like this. An idyllic, or at least functional, civilization is threatened by some evil. The regular structures or institutions, such as government or law enforcement, are incapable of stopping or are complicit in these villainous acts, and so a hero emerges in order to restore order. Called to fight and aided by fate, the hero enacts a decisive victory that restores the balance and then fades into obscurity. It's not hard to lay this template over any Western movie, but this kind of storytelling has now become extremely prominent with the popularity of superhero movies, and even before that with superheroes in comics. So much so that Jewett and Lawence even went on to write a follow-up book called The Myth of the American Superhero, just to outline their point about the American monomyth. But if you were paying attention, which I'm sure you were because you watch my show and that makes you pretty fucking clever. What? I'm not above flattery. I said that the Punisher was a revisionist Western. This is a subset of Westerns that were concerned more with a deconstructionist approach to the genre, often doing away with the white hat good guy, black hat bad guy oversimplified dichotomous morality of the genre. And the easiest way to do that was to have a morally compromised character as the protagonist, usually referred to as an anti-hero. And now you see where I'm going with this. My first clue to why I was wrong about the Punisher and why it's actually a revisionist Western was the music. The opening theme of the show makes use of a finger-picked guitar to give a classic Western vibe. This is paired with a higher register lap steel or slide guitar and electric guitars. All of the melodic lines used are all Southern blues, which just means that some of the notes used in this particular melodic pattern are outside of the key to create a clashing harmony. This creates a very distinct mood. With the sliding electric guitars and the use of distorted vibrato on other guitars, it becomes hard not to understand that this is the sound of country and Western music, but mixed with an evil or haunting feeling. It's Western sounding, but it has this moody, melancholic undertone. Distinctly Western, but very sinister. Oh yeah, that's the good shit. For an example in the show, look at the scene where Frank says goodbye to Amy in Season 2. For most of this scene, there's no music, just the two of them talking. But when the bus shows up and the two of them struggle to say goodbye, the music picks up, and it's two acoustic guitars playing soft but melodic blues lines, accompanied by piano. In the Season 2 opener, Roadhouse Blues, we see Frank enter a bar with a live band playing a Delta blues style of country music. This is an example of diegetic music, or music within the show's own universe that acts as an indicator to the audience that this is in fact a Western. Also, Roadhouse Blues just screams country and Western. The fact that Frank is an anti-hero pretty much already makes him a great fit for this kind of reading. But the biggest difference in this show versus other superhero movies is that Frank is an incredibly sympathetic anti-hero, which is not the same as a sympathetic villain because those are a bit weird. Yeah, let's not forget that at the end of this movie, Cruella still wants to skin puppies. This version of Frank is far more sympathetic in how it deals with the loss of his family, and how it's heavily implied in his introduction in Daredevil that the bullet that was intended to kill him may have caused some kind of brain damage that leads this version to the Punisher's rage, which almost acts like his superpower. In the revisionist Western, the protagonist is sympathetic, but they're still not morally good. Frank has done some terrible things, and as such, most people are terrified of him. But Frank himself is not a wholly bad person. Just like any revisionist Western, the show often takes the time to explore Frank's past and the things he's done. But it's purposeful, as it frames these terrible, awful things for what they are, even if they're sometimes done for morally righteous reasons. This is important because although Frank does the right things often, he's not a good person. He admits to murdering innocent people in his past, and although he regrets it and it always sticks with him, he still never tries to excuse his way out of it.
Did Billy Russo pull the trigger?
No, he did not. I did.
Both Frank and Daredevil struggle with their morality, but we can see that they have very different ideals about justice and killing, with the Punisher being far more brutal and lethal. The Punisher is a violent show, and somehow that's still an understatement. And I know that violence in general can put people off, but what if I told you that the brutal violence of the Punisher is actually part of the point of the revisionist Western, and not just for shock value? What makes the revisionist Western different from a regular Western is the very important distinction in the approach to why the hero fades into obscurity. In a traditional Western, the hero shows up because they are called by the need to right a wrong and ask for no thanks out of selflessness. Then they ride off into the sunset because they are just that good. In a revisionist Western, the anti-hero is separate and dwells in obscurity from the town or civilization they find themselves in because they are steeped in violence. The moral ambiguity of the character and the mistakes of their past are always related to some act of violence that they have committed. This violence cannot exist peacefully in the normal society of the story, and more often their presence is the inciting incident that reveals the corruption or evils in that civilization. However, the violence that they bring and represent is necessary to right those same evils, but once their task is complete, they cannot continue to exist in that society and therefore must fade into obscurity due to their violent otherness rather than their moral selflessness. The Punisher fits this to a T. Wherever Frank goes, violence is almost sure to follow. Part of the show's appeal is its excellent and brutal choreography. In fact, I would argue that the biggest distinction between this and other versions of the Punisher is how much more emphasis there is on hand-to-hand combat rather than weapons. It never flinches away from creative combat in the use of found objects or environments, but even more important is that every gunshot, every knife wound, and every blow counts. And if Frank was a normal person, he would definitely have died more than a few times. Every time a character gets hit, we see the fallout. We watch as the blow connects, and the camera doesn't shy away from showing it. And on top of that, they must have put the makeup effects team through the fucking ringer, because the number of cuts, lacerations, bruises, bullet wounds, and blood is through the roof. But they have to look good, and they have to be brutal, because the violence is the point. The violence is a necessary evil to right the wrongs of corruption. Whenever Frank shows up, we see violence occur, but only because an innocent person is in a situation where some form of violence threatens them. So Frank uses violence in opposition to save that innocent person. We see this with Micro asking for Frank's help, but especially with Amy, who is chased by those who would harm her. Frank saves them both and deals with the corruption of their respective stories. But when the need for violence is over, Frank has to fade into obscurity. Roadhouse Blues is again a great example. Frank is the lonesome stranger who rolls into a peaceful place where he finds an innocent who is going to be harmed and uses violence to try and save her, but this winds up getting other innocents hurt. Even though things return to normal, his violence cannot be endured, which means he is forced to leave. This episode is fucking textbook revisionist Western, and what's more, they even call it out during the episode.
Just passing through.
Where to?
Next place I'll be passing through.
Well, you got the Man of Mystery thing down, I'll give you that.
At the end of both seasons, even though Frank has built relationships with these people, he always leaves. I was among the people who would have liked to have seen Micro come back, but even more so, I thought Frank and Amy's dynamic was fantastic. But Frank knows he cannot stay. He never goes to dinner with Micro's family.
Alright, let's do this.
David, I'm not coming. You know why I can't.
And he denies Amy's appeal to continue to stay together.
Last chance. We're good together.
You're a kid. Who act like one.
The Punisher is the violent other in the revisionist Western. What makes this even more interesting is the dichotomy and Frank's own understanding of his role as the Punisher. For most of the series, Frank has to come to grips with not only his past violence, but his current role as the Punisher and what that means. Frank as a person is very different from Frank as the Punisher. In the show, we very rarely see Frank wear the iconic skull, and we're often reminded of how Frank views his own violence. When Frank isn't wearing the skull, we see him work towards righting the wrongs done to others through his own brand of vigilante justice, as fucked up as that might be, or working towards vengeance. But we also see he is careful about when and how he uses violence. Frank often respects the people he is fighting against, especially when they are military personnel doing their duty, and super especially when they uphold the justice that he violates. For Frank the man, violence is often an effective tool, but the worst one to choose because there's no coming back from it.
I don't want to have to kill you. Now look, I'm gonna go that way. You do what you gotta do.
Frank never really wants to hurt people if they stand for what is right, and he never wants to hurt innocents because they don't deserve the violence he brings. And this often eats Frank up when they are caught in the crossfire, even if he didn't pull the trigger.
It was murder.
You think Frank doesn't know that? That haunts him. That and everything that came after.
However, a few times in the show we see Frank suit up and put on that skull. When this happens, Frank becomes the Punisher for real. This only happens when the people that Frank is up against are going to do violence on him or others and there is no other option. When he puts that skull on, Frank is no longer working towards doling out justice or vengeance. This is now only about violence. A violence that Frank himself sees as a necessary evil. The country and western music and instrumentation, the adherence to the formula of the revisionist version of the American Monomyth with the emphasis on a sympathetic antihero, the use of violence, and the separation of Frank and the Punisher persona really changed the way I viewed the Punisher, because the violence and broodiness isn't just for show, but important pillars of a revisionist western story. And it really made me understand and enjoy the sympathetic antihero that the Punisher is. He's a fun character to study, explore, and write about because of his complex morality and inherent violence. And I want to see and enjoy more of this, but in fiction, not in the news. The Punisher doesn't see himself as a hero of any kind. He sees himself as a necessary evil. Frank doesn't want people to be like him. He's a villain, but he does have someone that he believes in and is his hero. And that's Captain America and what he represents. As to what that is, well, you'll just have to wait for next episode. But that is why I was so wrong about the Punisher and why it's actually a revisionist western. Here are my stray thoughts. I didn't really mention any of the previous versions of the Punisher because I'm less familiar with them and I wanted to focus on why I'm such a fan of this version. I also didn't really mention the Punisher's inclusion in Daredevil because that wasn't really Frank's story, but make no mistake, as much flack as season 2 gets, those first 4 episodes are some of the best television ever. I think Billy's face as Jigsaw should have been way more messed up, and as always, I will continue to ask for John Barenthal to return as the Punisher. Yeah, those sentiments have still not changed. Hey! Thanks so much for watching that episode. Let me know your thoughts on the Punisher, whether it's this version or any other. I had a lot of fun editing the visuals for this episode, but I kept getting distracted because I just wanted to watch the episodes. Remember to subscribe so you never miss another episode of This Is a Thing or our weekly podcast, and remember to stick around for all of Suptember, right here on Cinemasters Ultimate Timeline.